very, very, very good afternoon to you, wherever you are across this Caribbean and beyond the Caribbean region. And I'm Julian Rogers in Kingston, Jamaica. And today we share stories about the relationship between the Caribbean and the USA. And it comes with the advent of a new US administration headed by Joseph Biden and Kamala Harris. Are we expecting too much because this is a Democratic administration and that the vice president knows what is oxtail and roti? Well, I tell you, on a Saturday afternoon across the Caribbean, we could be enjoying pudding and sauce and a lot more. In fact, my friends down in Trinidad would be missing out on a carnival, and Dominica would be getting ready to enjoy calypso and much more. In Barbados, well, we're looking forward to the reggae festival and all of that. But let me introduce you to some of my friends on this Saturday afternoon. Vince Henderson, Dominica's ambassador to the USA and the OAS. And he is a legal, if I may say so, having studied law in the United States. He's chairman of SIDS DOC, which is a sustainable energy initiative for small island developing states. He's been in the Parliament of Dominica for 2 consecutive terms in 2000 and 2005. And during that time, he also served as a minister in several portfolios. So that's Vince not in Dominica. Vince is in Toronto, Canada, in the cold. That's why he's all bundled up there. But we'll get to hear from him in a minute. Marlene Attz is in Trinidad. She's got a PhD in economics. She's currently a lecturer in economics at the University of the West Indies. And she's also always referred to as a development economist because her primary research areas are in economics, so climate change adaptation, disaster risk management, particularly with respect to the challenges faced by developing countries, gender mainstreaming, and of course, disaster risk management with an emphasis on the role of civil society, etc., in sustainable development goals, and looking particularly at sustainable tourism. So she's the lady with a great smile out of Trinidad. And let me go then to Bridgetown, Barbados, and introduce you to another friend of mine, David Commissiong, who is Barbados' ambassador to CARICOM. He is an attorney as well. And David has a long history of activism, reminding Barbadians and the wider Caribbean community to have respect for their history. And Vincentian born he is. Yeah, all right. But that's a whole nother story. But he's a founder of the Clement Payne movement in Barbados, and he once served as the head of the Barbadian government's Commission for Pan-African Affairs. And he is a frequent critic of globalization and the United States hegemony. So we've got David in Bridgetown, Barbados, and Vince is in Toronto, Canada, and Marlene is in Trinidad. So I want first to get your reactions to the arrival of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris in Washington, D.C. And one man who can tell us all about that, first of all, is Vince, because he was there in the cold. Vince, tell us about that experience.
Yes, Julian. Good afternoon to you, and good afternoon to Marlene and of course Ambassador Commission. Good afternoon to all the listeners and the viewers of Caribbean Bridges, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in the program. It was very interesting, Julian, to be in Washington, and I have to say though, while it was an excellent ceremony because of especially the diversity, and I also had the pleasure of attending the inauguration of President Trump, so I had the opportunity to do a comparison, and it was different by far. DC, Washington was militarized, and to me it was reminiscent of visiting some other parts of our hemisphere. I don't want to call the names of countries, but it was so heavily militarized that it made you feel as you were not in the United States at all. But all the same, it was indeed a very interesting ceremony that ushered in sort of a kind of diverse face of the United States, which is truly reflective of the United States.
And I'm sure that you were there pumped up a little bit because of Kamala Harris and her Jamaican roots.
Well, surely. I mean, we celebrate that. of course, the first female vice president, but more so a woman of African descent, but even closer home in the Caribbean from Jamaica. So we always consider ourselves as one people. And even in Washington, at the OAS, we all sit around as one Caribbean, and we represent, collectively as one Caribbean. So for us, it was a sense of pride. It was a proud moment for us.
I'm going to stay with you, Vince, because I want to get, now that you set the atmosphere, so to speak, and give me your first flush at what do you expect with this change of administration in Washington?
Julian, when you introduced me, you said I serve in different capacities as minister. I served as Minister of Foreign Affairs when President Obama was elected. And I made a statement for which I was heavily criticized. I said basically that President Obama at the time was the president of the United States of America, not the president of Black people in America or anywhere else. And therefore, his primary responsibility is to America. I feel the same way about whether it's President Joe Biden or Vice President Kamala Harris. The difference, though, however, is that we welcome the election of President Biden and Kamala Harris, because they will definitely have a change of tone. I think one of the key things, and I will say this too, the United States has its agenda as a world power, and clearly that will not shift because there's been a shift from Republican to Democrats. What I believe shifts is the method in which they achieve it, the way it's done. So we expect a little more decency in negotiations. We expect a little more respect, call it that, in diplomacy, and not necessarily looking at our interests, but there are cases where our interests will align. And I think climate change is clearly that area. Multilateralism is another area, because we expect a Biden administration, a Democratic administration in the United States, to be in favor of multilateralism. And we expect to see, sort of more cordial relations, and hopefully they can help us in areas like climate change. As they've entered the Paris Agreement, they have also given a commitment to participate in the COP26 in the UK later this year, in which we expect them to be a meaningful participants, unlike what we've seen in the past. So we expect to see, in some cases, the alignment of interests. And renewable energy, which I could talk about later, will definitely be a major boost for the world, because the United States has signaled that it is going to be focusing more in those areas. So clearly, we expect to see a number of areas where there will be shift, the re-entry into the WHO being great, the fact that the UN will see a less combative United States, and therefore an opportunity for more negotiations and discussions. Similarly at the OAS. And so we expect to see those things, but clearly in terms of material support or in any major initiative, I still, I'm not hopeful in those regards.
All right, fair enough. And I'm going to press you a little later on, of course, to talk about some of the aspects you raised there and hint at some of the things that you think will not see us seeing eye to eye, and therefore there's always an opportunity for discussion, I suppose, better diplomacy in this context. Let me go to Marlene, because I know, Marlene, I can't not give you an opportunity to react to the arrival of this new administration and the fact that there's a first woman vice president of the United States.
Thank you, Julian, and thanks again for inviting me to participate in this conversation, albeit on the two Saturdays before Carnival Saturday in Trinidad, if we were living pre-COVID life, but the reality is what the reality is. Of course, I, like many Afro-Caribbean women or women of Caribbean descent, welcome the opportunity to have someone who shares some connection with the Caribbean. It is also a welcome opportunity that someone as young as the vice president, and I consider her to be fairly young, is able to hold such a powerful position. And certainly from observing her on the campaign trail, she is very keen to essentially roll up her sleeves and get down to work to represent the interests of not only minorities, disadvantaged groups, to have a change in temperature, as Ambassador Henderson mentioned. I think one of the things that the world has kind of been viewing expectantly, and certainly us in the Caribbean, is a softening of the tenor coming out of Washington, D.C. So that is a welcome change. And of course, certainly hearing the Vice President on the campaign trail and in subsequent conversations she's had with the media, there is certainly a sense of pride that a woman of color has ascended to that position. Of course, the first woman, and we know all of the history behind it. So certainly for us in the Caribbean, I think it is something that we're looking forward to. She stands, as she always says, on the shoulders of all of the women who've gone before her, and certainly we have our share of very strong, powerful, motivated politicians coming out of the Caribbean, and certainly women in the diaspora as well coming out from the Caribbean. So I think it's a welcome opportunity for all of us.
So I'm giving you an opportunity, Marlene, now to give us a sense of what you expect. There's Kamala, there's Joe Biden, there's a Democratic administration, there's a change of tone, a change of personalities, etc. What should we realistically expect from the United States government?
All right. Well, I want to essentially predicate my comments in terms of the specific response to your question, predicated with what you used as the promo. When you sent out the initial promotional video, you were quoting a Guyanese US student who said that, the US needs to stop seeing the Caribbean as, needs to start seeing Caribbean as partners and not countries that they can control. And I was intrigued by that statement, and I wanted to suggest that in framing our conversation, or certainly from my perspective as a Caribbean academic, as a Caribbean person for whom interaction with the rest of the world is important for our economic development and in our economic space, I want to suggest that perhaps we start by reframing the undergirding conversation. So to my mind, it's less about the United States viewing us as partners, but for us in the Caribbean, seeing ourselves first and foremost as partners with each other, I mean the CARICOM group, but then also the wider Caribbean group of islands and countries, and then presenting that unified group as a potential set of partners, as some allies to the United States. So to me, I want to flip the script slightly and change the frame of the narrative to say that we in the Caribbean really need to see ourselves as potential allies for the United States and partners. And in moving forward, and Ambassador Henderson touched on a couple of points that I think are absolutely important for us. The United States signing on to Paris, certainly the tenor at every stage during the campaign, even leading up to the result now in 2020 and into the inauguration in 2021, the issue of climate change. For us in the Caribbean and small and developing states, climate change is essentially a significant driver in terms of our economic development. For some countries more than ours, Trinidad and Tobago, a net exporter of energy, climate change mitigation and the emission of greenhouse gases is going to have an impact on Trinidad and Tobago's economic trajectory. But then for many of the other Caribbean countries, the ones that are involved in tourism, the ones that are involved in agriculture, a very important dimension. So for us to now have a change in the temperature coming out of Washington, where that change in temperature says that we, and no pun intended, that change in administration admits and acknowledges the issues of climate change, it means that there is an opportunity for us in this part of the world and smaller and developing states generally to at least have the opportunity to engage in a conversation with a superpower that says these are our circumstances and these are some of the areas in which we would like some support. So when we go to the negotiating tables, whether it's in Paris or the next meeting, at least the Caribbean knows that one of the major superpowers is in fact an ally. And then of course, there's the intersecting space for us in the Caribbean between COVID-19 and climate change. So all of the protocols for COVID-19 say that, you need to wash your hands, you need to engage in social distancing. One of the climate change impacts that can potentially affect us is, of course, water shortages. In many of our islands, we know that we have water shortages. It's a climate change impact that can be exacerbated in years to come. All of these are going to be issues for us. And then there is something that is going to affect us, I think, even more significantly that we need to have a conversation around, is that the IMF has recently announced that when they do their country assessments, what we normally call the Article 4 consultations, they are now going to include in those economic assessments issues of climate change, whether it's climate change mitigation or climate change adaptation. So for those of us in the Caribbean states and for other countries around the world, where climate change is in fact one of the threats or one of the drivers for economic development trajectory, coupled with the change in the administration in Washington, coupled with those of us that have a relationship with the IMF, it means that the issue of climate change is certainly going to be catapulted in terms of our national economic spaces. So, and then some of the other things Ambassador Henderson alluded to, the fact that the United States has gone back to the WHO, the issue of COVAX and vaccines that will reach us in our part of the world and other developing countries. Those are important issues for us. The softer tenor, the softening of the position in terms of migration. We know how important remittances are for our part of the world, and all of these kinds of issues. And of course, what Ambassador Henderson referred to as you know, an enhanced diplomacy. We're looking forward to that because to get our economies and to assist our economies to recover from the impacts of the pandemic and then of all of the other associated economic challenges that we've been facing, we are going to need multilateral cooperation. We are going to need different kinds of levels of diplomacy. So I think all in all, we are looking forward to fresh opportunities and a new start in terms of the relationships between the United States and the Caribbean.
You covered a lot of ground there, Marlene, but I think the common, and I will use the word common again, because I think you point really to what I consider, or many consider, to be one of the biggest challenges of the region, that is of acting together. Mm-hmm. And I know as a CARICOM ambassador, David Commissiong has very much enunciated that time and time again in his conversations with everybody up and down this region. But I want to bring him in here and also give you, David, an opportunity to talk about the arrival of this new administration and your expectations.
Yes, well, thank you, Julian. It's a real pleasure to be here and speaking to a pan-Caribbean audience. I first of all want to pick up on what Marlene said. This notion that it is more about how we see ourselves and how we view the United States of America. And I like to go back to the Right Excellent Errol Walton Barrow, former Prime Minister of Barbados, national hero, who was very clear about who he was as a Caribbean man, and our position of absolute equality with any other country, large or small. And we need to be mindful of our history. There were three sources of British colonization in this Western Hemisphere. There was the Caribbean. There were the 13 North American colonies, and there was Canada. And for about 200 years, these three areas were virtually equal. In fact, I wouldn't even say equal. I would say the Caribbean and the 13 colonies were virtually equal. Canada lagged far behind, equal in terms of their productive value to the British Empire. And of course, the 13 colonies went on to win their independence in 1776, were able to unify and become one nation, and then were able to spread right across the rest of the continent. But even the young United States of America was very, very dependent on trade with the Caribbean. In fact, it was trade with the Caribbean that really initially drove their economic development. Canada as well. Canada, the early British colonies went on to expand right across the continent. So we know that in terms of size, yes, we unfortunately, we have not as successfully united our Caribbean area. And we need to learn that lesson. The two other poles of British presence in this hemisphere, not only did they go on to unite, but then they spread across their geographical region. So the point you make, yes, if we are going to engage sensibly with the United States of America, we need to do so from a position of absolute unity. In the recent past, we have found ourselves divided in CARICOM, unfortunately, on a number of issues. We need to correct that. In fact, I have been urging that we are going to be having our CARICOM heads of government intersessional meeting in Trinidad in February. And I've been urging very strongly that we need to grasp that opportunity. Our heads need to grasp that opportunity to have an intimate in-caucus discussion among themselves about this incoming US administration, the possibilities that this has brought with it, and the need for us to be seamlessly united in engaging with that administration, and how do we deal with or negotiate any differences among ourselves first, so that we maintain that seamless unity. And that's what Article 6 of the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas says is expected of us. We are expected to coordinate our foreign policy, and we are expected to engage with third countries and entities in a united manner. Now, clearly, with the incoming administration, there's already significant policy changes. I think Marlene and Vince enunciated a few of them. The other two I would put on the table are the rewarming of relations with Cuba and the signaling that this administration will be a lot less bellicose in dealing with Venezuela and will be seeking to initiate some kind of dialogue. So those added to the ones that Marlene and Vince have already spoken about: Paris Agreement, WHO, etc. Those are important policy differences. The question is, though, will it go beyond just important policy differences to some fundamental structural change in the relationship of the United States to the Caribbean, the attitude of the United States to the Caribbean? And, Vince is saying no. I am saying I am a little bit more hopeful. I'll tell you why. I think that fundamentally, the United States sees the Caribbean through the prism of race. We are a Black region, a region of Black and Asian people, Africans and Indians. And to the extent that the race issue has come to the fore in the United States with the whole Black Lives Matter, all that we saw last year, now the United States is going to be grappling with this issue going forward. But to the extent that we can have a significant breakthrough on the issue of race domestically, because foreign policy is often the flip side, the adverse side of domestic policy. And we have seen some incredible things. We have seen the new Black senator from Georgia winning that Senate seat. So we've seen a Black vice president, female vice president. So to the extent that there can be some significant breakthrough in the area of race domestically in the United States, I think that could set up a platform for a significant change in the country's attitude to the Caribbean region.
Well, David and Marlene and certainly Vince have given us some opening runs there on the board, so to speak. If you're just joining us, I'm Julian Rogers in Kingston, Jamaica. And let me remind you that this is Caribbean beaches, bridges, and beaches as well. Yes, by all means. I'd remind somebody today that Montserrat has beaches, but black sand beaches, and only one beach with white sand. But we go over the bridges and the beaches around the region and touch everybody. And so Vince Henderson is in Toronto, Canada. He is Dominica's ambassador, of course, to the USA and the OAS. Marlene is a development economist, and she's in Port of Spain, Trinidad. And David Commissiong, of course, CARICOM ambassador on behalf of Barbados. And you just heard him as the last speaker. I want to go back to Vince, though, because Vince, you've heard the other two contributors so far, and I want to get your reaction to the suggestion about holding together and representing a very unified voice in dealing with the United States. And particularly, I want to ask you about your experience of dealing with the other Caribbean diplomats in Washington.
Yeah, well, Julian, yeah, I miss the Caribbean sun, yeah, so, but it's getting warmer in here. I agree definitely with Marlene and of course with Ambassador Commissiong. I think the point made of us being more united Caribbean, I totally agree with that, but I want to go a little further though. I think that we must better define ourselves and what is it that we want. So there needs to be a clarity of purpose, as according to Prime Minister Gonzalez would say, as a Caribbean civilization. I think there has to be a definition of that clarity of purpose, and that would help us in our interaction, as Ambassador Commissiong said, with third parties, with third countries. And so therefore we need to know that. And I'll give you a case in point, Julian. President Biden, he was then Vice President Biden. That was about 2014, 2015, when the US hosted a Caribbean Energy Security Summit in Washington. Back then, we were not very clear on what it is that we wanted in the area of energy. What is the definition of energy security for us? Because at the time, a number of our countries had very close relations with Venezuela, and Dominica had particularly close relations with Venezuela, we still do today, with the Chavez administration and then Maduro administration. And we benefited from PetroCaribe, and it created for us, some cushion during especially the times of high oil prices. And we were able to, so the energy security summit, we attended that summit, but at the time we were not very clear on what it is that we wanted. And what I am seeing now is that we have matured, especially in the area of energy. We have now defined a clear strategy in CARICOM. So the CARICOM Secretariat with our governments have now have approved the Caribbean Renewable Energy Strategy, the CSIRMs, with a Caribbean energy policy. We have all member states participating in that. We have created the Caribbean Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency, and our organization sits up, and it is located in Barbados, which really was set up to assist member states to move their energy agenda forward. So we now, going back to Washington in March of this year, we'll be interacting with the US, all the development partners, the international development partners, and that time we are clear on what it is that we are presenting. So I agree with both Marlene and Ambassador Commissiong, and I believe that we really must be united. But I also believe we must have some clarity of purpose. We must know exactly what it is we want, so that when we get to the table, we're not only united in our position, but we're very clear on our position. So in terms of the last question, Julian, that you asked about my colleagues, it's very interesting in Washington, and I know the same at the United Nations. I spent 6 years there as ambassador, and I can tell you that is where we not usually have difficulties. I would say, ambassador, I know there is a need to have a common foreign policy, but that one eludes us worse than the free movement of people throughout the region. And I know from time to time we have disagreements. So that perhaps is one of the areas I think we have one of the biggest challenges, and that is something that we need to overcome.
So you're saying in essence, Vince, that the lobbying by a grouping such as CARICOM is not working in the Washington atmosphere?
It is effective, but up to a certain extent. And I think the last US administration really made it sort of more difficult for us, because what they did, for example, you recall at one point that some Caribbean heads were invited to meet President Trump, if you recall, and some others were not. We have seen some of us who, because we supported one position at the OAS, that the United States felt that because we were not towing the line and supporting their position, that they would not interact with us and they would pull out from the CARICOM member states that would support their position. So that made it very fractious and sort of difficult for us to have a unified position. But on most issues, but that is just the exception, I should say. On most issues, we had a united front and we were able to achieve a number of things. And it works, but there are times where we really, and perhaps the times we need it the most, we really don't pull together. We make it difficult for us to have our Caribbean position, one Caribbean position.
All right, so we need one Caribbean position on Cuba, for instance.
Sorry.
Yes. Go ahead, Vince.
No, that's the easiest one. I think that Cuba is the one we're united on. I honestly, I must, we have always agreed, whether it's at the United Nations, even when the US in particular is not very pleased, we have always supported Cuba. And I must say, I'm always proud of the way, as Caribbean people, we have stood with our Caribbean, brothers and sisters in Cuba. I think it really speaks a lot to who we are and the true strength of a Caribbean people when we are united and we decide we're taking a position. And we've really done a great job in our support to Cuba, unwavering.
And I will ask Marlene on this one, because I mean, Cuba really has been a friend and a partner across the Caribbean for more than 25 years. We have that history, and so on. And at the height, even before the pandemic, every time there's a hurricane and damage or emergency disaster, the case may be, Cuba has been there, and Cuba has been part of the health delivery systems of many of these Caribbean territories, etc. And so we got the COVID, and they've got COVID vaccines in development and in use and whatever else. But there appears to be a reluctance or misunderstanding about Cuba's position, even in our Caribbean environment.
I was heartened to hear Ambassador Henderson's unequivocal statement that among the Caribbean states, there is no disagreement. And in terms of our collective position towards Cuba, and that is my sense. I mean, I don't sit in the same circles as Ambassador Henderson, but certainly my sense has been, from an academic perspective, I can speak that we have always been the University of the West Indies, and certainly myself as an economist, I have colleagues who are Cuban economists, and certainly in terms of the work of climate change and sustainable tourism, I know that there is a lot that Cuba has to offer, both in terms of the human capital, and you mentioned some of it, Julian. Those of us in the Caribbean, many of the Caribbean countries have benefited from Cuban medical personnel, their doctors, their nurses, etc. Some of our students go to Cuba to study medicine. We've also benefited from them in terms of their capacity building arrangements, areas like climate change, agriculture, a whole host of issues. So for us, Cuba, separate and apart from what may be a barrier to some in terms of the language barrier, and many of our Cuban partners and friends are bilingual, so we do manage to bridge that language barrier. But I think Cuba stands as a beacon of hope for us in the Caribbean in terms of what the possibilities are and the kind of what should I call symbiotic relationships that can occur between Cuba and the rest of the Caribbean. But in translating that, and of course, I get the sense, and I know the two ambassadors will have a greater appreciation for this than I do. The new administration is open to that conversation. So I think it presents, as I said, another opportunity for there to be a richness and a cross-fertilization of ideas between coming out of Washington and for us in the Caribbean. And when I say Caribbean, I'm speaking almost, with two hats on, the CARICOM region, of which I'm a part, but also the wider Caribbean, because we also have our brothers and sisters in Haiti, in the Dominican Republic, etc. So I think that's also another aspect of the conversation that we need to be clear on when we represent, and this is not, again, in any way trying to say that I understand either of the ambassadors in terms of the scope of their roles and functions, but we need to be clear whether CARICOM has, as a unit, there are going to be some commonalities in terms of how we approach new administration, because very often there is a lack of clarity between the CARICOM, the English-speaking Caribbean that is beyond CARICOM, and the wider Caribbean, which includes our non-English speaking brothers and sisters. And I think while there are common threads and common issues and common challenges that we face, we also need to be mindful that those of us in the CARICOM region have a different set of challenges. So I heard Ambassador Henderson speak about the energy policy coming out of CARICOM and you know, the historical relationship with Petrocaribe, etc. Trinidad and Tobago's case is different. So when we talk about energy security in Trinidad and Tobago, it is a different kind of conversation for Trinidad and Tobago as opposed to the rest of the CARICOM countries, so to speak. And the other thing that I want to just close off this point on is, again, when we meet with these multilaterals, and there is a meeting coming up in March, well, the intersessional for CARICOM, but also when they start having the spring meetings in Washington, and the IMF unfolds or shares greater information on how they are going to make the adjustments to their Article 4 consultations, I think we in the Caribbean, those of us in our central banks, in our ministries of finance, at the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank, the Central Bank of Barbados, etc., need to keep our eyes on that and have a firm understanding of what will be the implications of those adjusted Article 4 consultations and country economic assessments in terms of how the lens through which the IMF and possibly other multilateral agencies will therefore see us. Because if it is that they are going to take on board our vulnerabilities to climate change impacts, and those vulnerabilities are going to be reflected in terms of their Article 4 consultations or their economic assessment documents, it means that we really have to be prepared for how those new assessments would look and what they could possibly mean for us in terms of our macroeconomic policy. But that's, you know, that's a different kind of conversation. But to me, these are some of the things that we need to have a CARICOM or Caribbean position on, even as we go into those kinds of meetings, because clearly the multilaterals are already making adjustments based on the change in tenor and temperature coming out of Washington, D.C. And we really also have to be prepared for when we get to those negotiating tables, whether they're bilateral or multilateral sort of tables. We have to be clear what the Caribbean position is going to be in those conversations.
Thank you very much, Marlene. All right, I want to ask David a question, and this is a question posed by one of our viewers, in fact. David, can you comment on Julian's point about Cuba's vaccine development while we're standing in line for the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines, and maybe Johnson & Johnson's as well? David?
Yeah, sure. And I need to get back to the last point Marlene made. So remind me.
All right.
No, Marlene is right. We can't just be concerned about CARICOM. We also have to be concerned about something called the Caribbean civilization. Vince referred to it in his opening remarks. You see, when we think of the Caribbean civilization, then we include Cuba. Mm-hmm. And when we include Cuba, what Cuba brings with it, this biochemical industry that has the sophistication to develop new medicines and to make breakthroughs in medical science and develop vaccines for the COVID-19 virus. So yes, we also need to remember that it was the 4 independent English-speaking Caribbean countries that in 1972 had the courage to break the diplomatic isolation of Cuba that had been imposed on Cuba by the United States and the Organization of American States. It was Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados, and Guyana recognizing Cuba in 1972 that broke the ice. And then everybody else in the hemisphere kind of fell in line. So Vince is right. We have, if there's one foreign policy issue that we have been firm on, it is Cuba. And it is very important because, as I said, we need to look eye to eye with the United States on the basis of a Caribbean civilization. And Cuba is a very, very important part of that civilization. So the same way that the 14 independent CARICOM countries, all of them have Cuban medical teams assisting them in dealing with COVID-19. There should be no difficulty for us to go on to access COVID-19 vaccines from Cuba. I can tell you Barbados is already in discussions with Cuba about the COVID-19 vaccines. But bear in mind, Cuba is still testing. None of the tests have been concluded. They're very optimistic about the Soberana 2 vaccine, and they're about to start phase 3 of the tests for that vaccine. So, but definitely, that's our Caribbean civilization, and we will benefit from their prowess in developing vaccines. To get back to Marlene's point, though, about the international financial institutions, we need to be very clear about this. CARICOM has been pushing. CARICOM actually has something called the Caribbean Economic Recovery and Transformation Plan. That is the CARICOM plan that we have devised to get us through the economic and social crisis that COVID-19 has inflicted on our region. One of the centerpieces of that plan, we call it CERT, is something called the Universal Vulnerability Index. So we are saying that this measurement of GDP per capita for determining the vulnerability of a country and whether that country should have access to concessionary financing or different forms of assistance from the international financial institutions, we are saying that is a deeply flawed measure, and we are pioneering this universal vulnerability index that will bring in issues of climate change, the fact that we are small island nations with all kinds of specific vulnerabilities. So the CERT is demanding, and we have been pushing for this, an increase in the IMF special drawing rights so that we can increase the amount of foreign exchange available to us, a rescheduling of all of our COVID-19 debt. We want to reschedule it at very low interest rates and with a moratorium on repayments of some 7 to 10 years down the road. And we want to unlock additional funding from the IMF, the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank. And I should tell you that in July of 2020, as a result of our lobbying and agitation with the Trump administration, CARICOM received a letter signed by both the then Secretary of State, Mr. Pompeo, and the Secretary of the Treasury, confirming that they had accepted the CARICOM's argument that countries that had been graduated as middle-income countries like Barbados and Bahamas must get concessionary financing from the international financial institutions to help us through the COVID crisis, that they were using their leverage with the IMF to make immediately $1.7 billion available in financial assistance for COVID-related purposes. So the point I'm making, Marlene, is correct. We need to be unified on this. We need to be very clear on this. But I wish to say that we have been doing the work. And I think some of the positive things that she is sensing at the level of the international financial institutions isn't simply about a change in administration, the Biden administration. It's a product of some very serious work and some very serious lobbying that has been done by CARICOM. And let's bear in mind that Prime Minister Motley is the co-chair of the Development Committee of the IMF and the World Bank. And you know, Prime Minister Motley is not sitting in that chair simply warming the chair. So CARICOM is working. Yeah?
Yes. All right, David, that's a very good point. All right, let me remind you, those of you following us wherever you are on Facebook and on YouTube now, of course, this is Caribbean Bridges. I'm Julian Rogers. I'm in Kingston, Jamaica. David is in Bridgeton, Barbados. Marlene is in Port of Spain, Trinidad, and Vince is in Toronto, Canada. I come back to you, Vince, because I have a question for you related to the operation of the OAS. We've seen it really damaged by the United States positions in the last 4 years, and particularly creating a lot of difficulties in the handling of the Venezuelan situation, etc. How do you think the change administration and the new players in the hemispheric office will come to make the critical adjustments required in the OAS?
Well, Julian, I think first of all, the point has been made. I think all three of us agree on that we would expect to see a change in the manner in which diplomacy is exercised. We expect to see that change, and of course at the OAS. But even in the case of Venezuela, this thing has been handled so badly by the United States. I can tell you, it was just the way it was managed, from the recognition, of a self-declared president, Juan Guaido, to the manner in which resolutions were pushed through the OAS, sometimes in violations to the charter of the OAS, and that was raised by CARICOM, and especially I know Antigua and Barbuda was very vocal in making that point. We were excluded from the process, so there was never any attempt to get support on a common position, and it created some tensions at the OAS that was really not helpful. It was not productive at all, because we were not able to reach to some common position. So we expect to see some movements in that. But clearly, as I said, in the beginning, the United States is one of the major powers, and the United States will continue to exercise its role in spite of obviously a more warming of relations and a politeness in the conduct of their foreign relations. But I would still expect there to be quite a bit of push. What we hope, however, is that there is an opportunity for dialogue, meaningful dialogue, and to give the process an opportunity to work. And I like the point that David made earlier, that some changes is because of the hard work that happened, behind the scenes, work done by partners who perhaps may not be of the same position, but can at least negotiate their way through a common solution to ensure that we can solve some of those more divisive issues at the OAS. But there's a lot I would expect to shift at the OAS, and the CARICOM, I hope, will continue to be united around those major issues. As I said, we've been fragmented on some of those issues. We found ourselves because we allow others to put distance between us, and that was unfortunate. And I hope that this new administration will give us an opportunity to reset that relationship, especially at the OAS, because some real crazy things happened there, I can tell you, and I really wasn't happy to be part of it. And we held our position. We were consistently holding our position, but we're also willing to sit with other CARICOM member states and to hear their point. But you cannot, in diplomacy, you cannot come to a resolution if you don't talk. And some people say talk is cheap, but I like how Ban Ki-moon used to say that the UN, talk is good. It's only when we talk, to each other that we can make some progress and get to a common position. But what we saw, I'm telling you, man, the last 4 years, people didn't want to talk to each other.
Vince and Marlene and David, I want to raise something with all of you, and that is the role of our people in the diaspora. I know it's been talked about how we can mobilize them, and a lot of efforts been made over time, but it would seem to me that if there was ever a time for us to mobilize our diaspora community, it is now. They have been the firm supporters of this Caribbean community by sending back to the region the largest amount of remittances. We have the record with Latin America, etc. But really and truly, this is an opportunity for all the Caribbean people who are living in the United States and even Europe and wherever else, etc., to really come to the aid of the party, so to speak. Don't you agree? And how can we do that? David?
Yes, Julian, most definitely. You would know that in Barbados we were going to be celebrating a year of We Gathering in 2020. We had actually started, and the concept of We Gathering was really Barbados reaching out to its diaspora. But COVID put paid to it. But the idea that Barbados had was that we are planning even to amend our constitution to confer citizenship on the grandchildren. Right now, the children of a Barbadian, the child born overseas in the United States, for example, is entitled to citizenship, but we want to take it one generation further. So the grandchild, and that is part of the thinking as to how we could cement this relationship with the diaspora. So this is very important. I know Jamaica has been paying a lot of attention to its diaspora as well, and this is an idea that really needs to take hold right across CARICOM. We have the sense that members of the Caribbean diaspora were activated and played an important role in the recent presidential election in the United States. So it seems to me, I really think that 2020 was a very historic year. I think that Black Lives Matter protests and that upsurge, I think that is very significant. And I think there's something there. Of course, we will see how it plays out in the months ahead. But I think that the scene is really set for a greater mobilization of Black people, Black African Americans, but also members of the Caribbean diaspora. And at the level of CARICOM, we need to think about what kind of structures we could put in place to cement that relationship. I know that we have a fairly healthy relationship already with the Congressional Black Caucus, and we need to further that, develop that relationship as well. So yes, definitely, I am cautiously optimistic. As I said, foreign policy, the flip side of domestic policy. And if we can get these breakthroughs on the race issue domestically in the United States, it could have positive implications for that country's relationship with the Caribbean.
Marlene, what do you say?
Well, a couple of things I'd like to say, Julian. I know your clock is ticking, but if I could just go back a little.
Yeah, I have time for you, Marlene. Go ahead.
Yeah. If I can just go back to the issue of Venezuela, and then I'll segue into the conversation around the diaspora.
Yeah.
I think it is no secret that it will redound to the benefit of the entire Caribbean region for the socio-economic, political issues in Venezuela to be resolved, and in very short order. All of us in the Caribbean region have our economies that are now trying to grapple with the issue of the Venezuelan migrants, some to a greater extent than a lesser extent. And what has been described as a humanitarian crisis really is something that I think all of us in the Caribbean region have a stake in seeing it resolved, and seeing it resolved in short order. So the breath of fresh air in terms of the conversation between Washington and the OAS and some of those other international organizations, and as it relates to Venezuela, I think is something that we welcome, and we would really wish to see some resolution that addresses this humanitarian crisis and all of the other issues that are associated with Venezuela's position as a partner to many of the Caribbean countries. I mean, we spoke about Petrocaribe in the first couple of minutes of this afternoon's conversation, but it really redounds to all of our benefit, if only to address the issue of of the Venezuelan migrants that many of our Caribbean countries are now facing with. So we're adding another layer to the socioeconomic dimension of what our governments are treating with. In terms of the conversation around the diaspora and remittances, etc., of course, absolutely important. We know that the United States was built on migrants, and Caribbean migrants have over centuries supported the American economy. And of course, that also redounds to our benefit. It has in the past in terms of the remittances. The remittance flows to several of the CARICOM countries and even the Latin American countries. But I think it is particularly important now that we embrace and we understand what the softening of the position in terms of migration could mean for us. We have had our economies, by and large, don't want to use the word decimated for it to sound melodramatic, but we've had significant challenges and contractions in our economies because of COVID-19 and because of some of the attendant issues that have revolved around COVID-19. So the need, the fact that we have very little fiscal space in many of our Caribbean countries, so we would have had to resort to things like borrowings to deal with the health crisis that arose from COVID-19. The fact that we've had significant levels of unemployment. Our tourism sector has not been able to, we really had no tourism sector between 2019 and for all of 2020. We're not too sure what the prospects will be for 2021 unless we solve the issue of the vaccine. So it is even more significant for us to have a refreshed diaspora and employed diaspora in the United States, because those remittances are going to help alleviate things like poverty. So all of those families where the heads of households have become unemployed, all of those families that need to have investments, we need to have those remittances to allow us to reignite our economic spaces. So the conversation is not a siloed conversation about, well, we're going to have more migrants, or the United States is probably going to have a softer position in terms of migrants. But if we translate that and we look at those linkages, we realize that really that is going to be one aspect of how our economies are going to be revitalized and re-energized. So I think this is really an opportunity for us to have a different kind of thinking and to look at the intersecting spaces of so many issues: COVID-19, climate change, migration, the multilateral agencies, and how we as a Caribbean, and I still want to come back to where I started, we as the Caribbean people really have to finesse what is our ask and what do we want for ourselves before we even engage in those kinds of conversations with the new administration.
Marlene, you've done it perfectly. And all that's left for me to do is to say thank you very much to Vince in Toronto, to David in Bridgetown, and of course to Marlene. You've made my missing of pudding and sauce or whatever you normally have at this point on a Saturday afternoon very special. And I want to invite everybody to do me one other favor and join another conversation. It's conducted by 3 frustrated Bajans in London, and the program that they produce every Sunday is WI Global. Go there and like their show as well, as they have done for us here at Caribbean Bridges. To all of you, Caribbean people and friends of the Caribbean, thank you very much for joining us. And of course, our thanks to everybody behind the scenes who you don't see, like I am here. All the very best to you. Next time, Saturday, 5 o'clock here in Jamaica, 6 o'clock in the Eastern Caribbean, we'll get together again and meet at Caribbean Bridges.